Imagine a quiet, remote corner of the world where the air is so pure it hurts and the mountains hold ancient secrets. Here, two brilliant young minds, full of life and promise, vanished into thin air. Their disappearance was a story we've all heard before. Tragic tale of human lives claimed by nature, is brutal, unfeeling embrace. For 9 long years, their memory was a cold, silent ghost, a case frozen in time. But what if that story was a lie? What if the wilderness wasn't just a grave, but a keeper of a secret so bizarre, so biologically impossible, that it would tear open a decade-old wound and reveal a darkness no one ever expected? This is a story of love, loss, and a hunter who, in a moment of grim discovery, found a truth too monstrous to ignore, a truth tangled in the antlers of a moose. Before we unravel this chilling mystery, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us tell these incredible stories. The first sign of trouble at the remote Alaskan research station wasn't a blaring distress signal or a frantic cry for help. It was the quiet, persistent sight of 2 unoccupied bunks. It was August 2007. The station, a cluster of sturdy cabins nestled deep in the wilderness, was a seasonal home for academics studying the unique, fragile ecosystems of the far north. The air inside the main cabin usually buzzed with a shared intellectual energy, the quiet intensity of data analysis, the murmur of excited conversations, and the warm, comforting scent of strong coffee. But on this particular Wednesday, the atmosphere felt different. It was heavy, thick with an unspoken anxiety that settled over everyone. Phineas Vogel, a geology professor from the East Coast, was meticulously organizing his rock samples when the silence from the adjacent room began to bother him. It was a silence he had never noticed before, a void where the familiar sounds of 2 of his colleagues should have been. He realized he hadn't seen the 2 botanists from California since Monday morning. While researchers often worked long, irregular hours, sometimes camping overnight at their study sites, this absence felt different, felt prolonged, especially given the rapidly changing weather. Outside, the sky was a bruised, ominous graya, prelude to a significant storm system already pushing an icy, biting wind down from the mountains. A feeling of dread, cold and sharp, began to creep into his heart. Vogel's concern grew too big to ignore. Sought out the lodge organizer, the person responsible for the complex logistics of the station. When he inquired about the botanists, the organizer checked the manifest. The realization that followed was immediate and alarming. Oki Koyamada, 31, and Yumi Hamasaki, 26, were scheduled to depart that very afternoon. Their bush plane was already booked for pickup, waiting to connect them to their flights back to California. A quick inspection of their room confirmed Vogel's worst fears. Their main luggage was packed and sitting by the door, ready for departure. But their specialized field packs the heavy-duty backpacks containing their scientific instruments. Specimen containers and crucial emergency survival gear were gone. They had not returned from their last excursion. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The silence was not a sign of them working late. It was a sign of their absence. Oki and Yumi were more than just respected figures in their academic circles. They were close friends, bound by a mutual obsession with rare alpine flora. Oki, the elder, was known for her meticulous methodology and quiet, unwavering determination. Yumi, at 26, brought a vibrant, almost childlike energy to their partnership. Eager to explore the challenging terrain in search of new discoveries, they traveled to this remote part of Alaska, specifically to study plant species that thrived only in these harsh, altitude conditions. They were partners in every sense of the word, a team built on trust, respect, and a shared passion for their work. Investigators later pieced together their last known movements by interviewing the other academics at the station. Kei and Yumi were last seen on Monday morning, preparing to head toward a notoriously difficult ridge several miles from the base camp. It was an area known for its unique microclimate and the specific plants they were studying. The incoming weather had been a topic of discussion that morning. Several researchers recalled advising caution, noting the rapidly dropping barometric pressure. According to witnesses, Oki and Yumi were aware of the forecast, but were determined to collect a final set of samples before the storm hit and their trip concluded. They were experienced, they respected the wilderness, and they seemed confident. They could complete the excursion and return before the weather turned severe. They were so close to the end of their journey, so close to home. But now, 48 agonizing hours later, the storm was beginning to break over the cabin, and their bunks remained empty. The isolation of the location meant that immediate help was not readily available. Phineas Vogel, recognizing the gravity of the situation and the unforgiving Alaskan environment, went to the cabin's only link to the outside world, the satellite phone. He made the call to the Alaska State Troopers, officially reporting Oki Koyamada and Yumi Hamasaki is missing. The transmission from the research cabin initiated an emergency response. But the Alaskan wilderness intervened with brutal efficiency. Almost immediately after Phineas Vogel's call, the predicted storm system slammed into the region with a ferocity that stunned even the seasoned researchers. This wasn't just a passing shower. It was a meteorological event, characterized by ferocious winds that seemed to tear at the very landscape. Driving rain that quickly turned to sleet, and a sudden catastrophic drop in temperature. For 3 agonizing days, the wilderness became an impenetrable fortress. The Alaska State Troopers, tasked with search and rescue operations in this vast territory, were completely grounded. The bush planes, essential for accessing the remote location, couldn't fly in the zero visibility conditions. The turbulence was too severe, the risk of icing too great. Ground teams couldn't mobilize either. The trails, difficult under the best of circumstances, were now treacherous, obscured by the weather, and threatened by flash flooding in the lower elevations and whiteout conditions higher up. The delay was excruciating. Every hour that passed significantly decreased the probability of survival for anyone caught exposed. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety and guilt. The researchers huddled around maps, trying to pinpoint the exact route Oki and Yumi might have taken, identifying potential shelters or hazards along the way. But the conversations always circled back to the same grim reality. The storm was relentless, and the wilderness was unforgiving. It was a race against time that they were losing. As the storm raged, the news of the disappearance reached California. Etsuo Hamasaki, Yumi's mother, was plunged into a nightmare that felt all too real. Etsuo had always been immensely proud of her daughter's achievement, Sumi's intelligence, her adventurous spirit, and her dedication to science. The thought of her vibrant, capable daughter lost in the brutal Alaskan weather was paralyzing. But Etsuo refused to succumb to despair. A mother's love is a powerful, unyielding force. As soon as travel became feasible, she flew to Alaska, determined to be present and to push for answers. She could not just sit and wait. She had to do something, anything, for her daughter. When the storm finally abated after 72 hours, the landscape had been transformed into a cold, desolate canvas. The clear skies, however, allowed for the mobilization of a massive search effort. Alaska State Troopers, specialized search and rescue SAR teams, and experienced local volunteers converged on the area. The operation was a logistical behemoth. Utilizing helicopters for aerial surveys and ground teams for meticulous grid searches, the air buzzed with the sound of rotor blades, the silence of the wilderness broken by the urgent, desperate hum of the search. Etsuo Hamasaki arrived at the command center, her face etched with a profound exhaustion and fear that seemed to haunt her every step. She met with the lead investigators, her voice tight with emotion as she provided them with detailed information about Yumi and Oki's experience. Their equipment and their meticulous planning. She was distraught, but fiercely insistent that the pair were too competent, too prepared to simply get lost. They knew what they were doing, she reportedly told the investigators, her voice cracking with emotion. They wouldn't have taken reckless risks. Something else must have happened. Her presence served as a constant, painful reminder of the human cost of the disappearance, a mother's silent plea for her child's return. The search focused intensely on the ridge system and the trails leading to it. The terrain was incredibly difficult. The SAR teams navigated steep inclines, dense brush that seemed to claw at their clothing and gear, and unstable scree slopes where every step threatened a dangerous slide. They moved slowly, methodically, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign. A footprint, a piece of discarded equipment, a makeshift shelter. The physical demands were extreme, pushing the searchers to their absolute limits. Days into the exhaustive search, a ground team located a small but significant trace. Near a particularly steep incline, partially obscured by debris washed down by the storm, they found a specialized botanical specimen container. It was the type used by Oki and Yumi, designed to protect delicate plant samples. The discovery was sobering. It confirmed they had reached this challenging area, but the context was ambiguous. The location of the container suggested a potential accident. The incline was treacherous, a mixture of loose rock and slick mud. A fall here would almost certainly be catastrophic. Had the container been dropped during a desperate scramble for footing? Or had it been intentionally discarded, perhaps to shed weight as the storm hit and survival became the only priority? The investigators analyzed the scene meticulously, established a perimeter, photographing the container in situ before recovering it. They searched the immediate vicinity for any further evidence: a scrap of fabric, a blood trail, anything that might indicate the circumstances of the disappearance. But the trail vanished at that point. The severe storm damage had erased any footprints or other discernible signs of their subsequent movements. The wilderness had effectively cleaned the slate, wiping away any answers. The prevailing theories among the investigators centered on environmental factors. Most likely scenario was that Oki and Yumi were caught in the sudden onset of the storm. In the high-altitude environment, visibility would have dropped to zero almost instantly. They could have become disoriented, perhaps stepping off the trail and succumbing to hypothermia within hours. The catastrophic fall, suggested by the location of the container, remained a strong possibility. Wildlife attack, always a consideration in the Alaskan wilderness, was also explored. The area was home to brown bears and moose, both capable of lethal encounters. However, there was no evidence to support this theory. The scene was clean, undisturbed by the signs of a violent struggle. The disappearance seemed silent, a vanishing without a trace. As the weeks dragged on, the massive search effort yielded nothing further. The Alaskan summer is brief, and the approach of winter brought a new urgency. The temperatures dropped rapidly, and the first snows began to dust the higher elevations. The window for searching was closing. The landscape was about to be sealed under a thick blanket of snow, hiding its secrets until the spring thaw. With no new leads and the environmental conditions deteriorating, the authorities made the difficult decision to scale back the active search. Etsuo Hamasaki protested, pleading for the search to continue. Convinced that Yumi and Oki might still be alive, perhaps injured and sheltering in a cave or a ravine. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. The risk to the searchers was too great, the probability of success too low. The disappearance of Oki Koyamada and Yumi Hamasaki was officially classified as a tragic accident. 2 lives claimed by the indifferent wilderness. The case, lacking any evidence of foul play, slowly went cold, frozen under the accumulating layers of Alaskan snow. Etsuo returned to California, the silence of the Alaskan wilderness echoing in the sudden, unbearable emptiness of her life. 9 years passed. The disappearance of the 2 botanists faded from the immediate consciousness of the Alaskan authorities, becoming another file in the cold case archives, a somber reminder of the wilderness's unforgiving nature. Etsuo Hamasaki continued to navigate a life defined by unresolved grief, the absence of her daughter a constant, aching void. The wilderness held its secrets, and the story of Oki and Yumi seemed destined to remain a mystery, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Then, in September 2016, something happened. The setting was a remote area of the Alaskan wilderness, many miles from the original search site. The environment here was different from the high-altitude terrain where the botanists had vanished. It was characterized by dry, yellowish-brown grass and sparse stands of trees, the typical landscape of late summer transitioning into autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry earth and pine, and the silence was profound. Garrick Ryland, an experienced local hunter, was moving slowly and deliberately through this terrain. Ryland was a man deeply connected to the wilderness, possessing a knowledge of the land that transcended maps and GPS coordinates. It was moose hunting season, and Ryland held a legal permit. He wasn't looking for a trophy. He was looking to fill his freezer for the winter. He was days away from the nearest road, completely self-sufficient, immersed in the solitude of the backcountry. He had been tracking a large bull moose for several hours, following the subtle signs of its passage, a snapped twig, a faint impression in the soft earth, the scent of musk carried on the breeze. The wilderness demands patience, and Ryland possessed it in abundance. He moved quietly, minimizing his presence, scanning the horizon for movement. Finally, he spotted the animal. It was a massive bull moose, an impressive specimen with a dark brown, almost black coat, and an enormous rack of antlers, wide and heavy. The moose was browsed peacefully in a small clearing near a willow thicket, unaware of Ryland's presence, perhaps 100 yards distant. Ryland settled into a stable shooting position, his movements practiced and fluid. He raised his rifle, the weight familiar and reassuring. He peered through the high-powered scope, the magnified view bringing the moose into sharp focus. He scanned the animal, noting its healthy condition, preparing for a clean, ethical shot. But as his gaze traveled up to the antlers, he paused. Something was wrong. Lodged firmly in the massive structure of the left antler was an object that didn't belong. It was pale, contrasting sharply with the dark, velvety texture of the antler. It looked out of place, unnatural. Adjusted the magnification, puzzled. At first, he thought it might be a piece of debris, perhaps a branch, or a shed piece of bone the moose had inadvertently picked up while thrashing its antlers against the brush. A common behavior during the rutting season. But the shape was too distinct, the contours too familiar. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. It wasn't debris. It was a human skull. Ryland lowered his rifle slightly, his heart pounding against his ribs. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, then looked again, confirming what he initially refused to believe. The skull was weathered, yellowish-white, indicating long exposure to the elements. The lower jaw was missing, but the most grotesque detail was the segment of the cervical spine, the neck vertebrae still attached to the base of the skull, dangling down from the cranium. It was firmly entangled in the antler, as if fused with the bone. The sight was macabre, deeply unsettling. Ryland's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a cruel joke? A bizarre accident? He knew moose could be aggressive, but the way the skull was impaled on the antler suggested a force and precision that seemed beyond the realm of a typical wildlife encounter. The image of the moose placidly grazing with this gruesome ornament attached to its head was surreal and horrifying. He was faced with a critical decision, a moral and practical dilemma that transcended the ethics of hunting. This was clearly evidence of a human death, possibly a crime scene, but the evidence was attached to a living, mobile animal. If the moose bolted, spooked by his presence, or a sudden shift in the wind, it could run for miles. It could disappear entirely into the vast wilderness, potentially dislodging the skull in the dense undergrowth. The evidence would be lost forever. Ryland weighed the options. He was in a legal hunting zone, and he had a tag for the moose. But his priorities shifted instantly from hunting to evidence preservation. He knew he had to secure the remains. The urgency was immediate. The wilderness held its secrets tightly, and this secret was on the move. He raised his rifle again, his focus absolute, took a breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The shot echoed through the silent landscape, a sharp crack that seemed to violate the stillness of the afternoon. The shot was clean. The massive bull moose staggered and collapsed. Ryland approached the animal cautiously. The silence of the wilderness seemed amplified now, heavy with the weight of his discovery. The sight of the skull up close was even more horrifying. It was firmly lodged, requiring significant force to remove. The contrast between the dark fur of the moose and the stark white of the bones was chilling. He knew he couldn't disturb the scene. He needed to contact the authorities immediately. He was far beyond cell range, but Ryland retrieved his satellite messenger, a device designed for emergencies in the remote backcountry. He marked his location with GPS coordinates and typed out a message to the Alaska State Troopers, detailing the nature of his discovery. Deceased moose with human remains attached to its antler. The response was swift. Due to the bizarre nature of the report, a helicopter was dispatched immediately. It took several hours for the troopers to reach the remote location. When they arrived, they were equally stunned. The scene was unlike anything they had ever encountered in their careers. They began the meticulous process of documenting the scene. The light was beginning to fade, adding a sense of urgency to the operation. They spread out a bright blue plastic tarp on the dry grass, a stark intrusion of synthetic color into the natural environment. With great effort, Maneuvering the massive 1,000-pound animal, they positioned the moose onto the tarp. The scene was photographed from every angle, the flash illuminating the grotesque entanglement of the skull and the antler. The logistics of removing the evidence were complex. The moose was too large to transport whole in the helicopter. The decision was made to decapitate the animal, ensuring the integrity of the skull and the antler connection. The remains, along with the moose head, were carefully secured and transported to the state medical examiner's office in Anchorage. Igric Ryland provided his statement detailing his discovery and his decision to shoot the animal. The investigators confirmed his actions were justified under the circumstances, prioritizing the preservation of critical evidence. The discovery sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The bizarre nature of the find posed questions that defied easy explanation. The arrival of the evidence at the State Forensic Laboratory in Anchorage caused an immediate sensation. The bizarre nature of the discovery, a human skull, entangled in the antlers of a freshly killed moose, demanded immediate and specialized attention. The remains were transferred to the custody of the medical examiner, and the complex process of identification and analysis began, a process that required the collaboration of forensic anthropologists, odontologists, and wildlife biologists. The skull itself was in a state of significant weathering. It had clearly been exposed to the elements for a prolonged period. It's the absence of the mandible lower jaw, and the partial nature of the remaining cervical spine suggested that the body had undergone decomposition and scavenging in the wilderness. The challenge was not just identifying the victim, but understanding the circumstances that led to this grotesque entanglement. Forensic anthropologists began their examination by carefully cleaning the skull, removing debris, and documenting its condition. They noted the absence of any obvious signs of trauma: no bullet holes, no fractures consistent with a blunt force impact. The weathering, however, made definitive conclusions difficult. They were able to establish a biological profile of the victim. Female, likely of Asian descent, estimated to be in her late 20s or early 30s at the time of death. The next step was identification. Given the condition of the remains, DNA analysis was possible, but would be time-consuming. The most direct route to identification was through dental records. Despite the weathering, the upper teeth maxilla were largely intact. Forensic odontologists analyzed the dentition, charting the fillings, restorations, and unique dental characteristics. This information was cross-referenced against the National Missing Persons databases. Searching for a match among the countless unsolved cases in Alaska, the process took several days. The database was extensive, filled with stories of individuals swallowed by the wilderness, but the specific combination of the biological profile and the dental characteristics narrowed the possibilities. And then, a match was found. The result was shocking, instantly connecting this bizarre discovery to a case that had been cold for nearly a decade. The skull belonged to Oki Koyamada. The identification was a bombshell. It instantly reactivated the 2007 disappearance, transforming it from a presumed tragic accident into a profound mystery. The location of the discovery, many miles from the original search area, raised immediate questions about the circumstances of her death. The news was delivered to the families. For Oki's family, it was a grim confirmation of her fate. 9 years of uncertainty, but replacing it with the horror of the discovery. For Etsuo Hamasaki, the news was agonizingly complex. The identification of Oki provided a measure of closure for her friend's family, but it reignited the intense speculation about Yumi's fate. If Oki's remains were found here, where was Yumi? Were they together when they died? The uncertainty, dormant for years, returned with renewed intensity. The investigation immediately shifted focus. The initial theories surrounding the discovery that the moose had attacked and killed Oki, or that it had simply picked up the skull from the ground, were now complicated by the timeline. If Oki died in 2007, the circumstances of the entanglement became even more baffling. Investigators consulted with wildlife biologists from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, seeking expert insight into moose behavior and the nature of their antlers. And it was here that the investigation encountered a critical, confounding paradox, a biological fact that shattered the entire timeline of the case. The biologists explained a fundamental aspect of moose physiology. Bull moose shed their antlers every single winter. The massive racks that characterize the males are not permanent structures. They are grown anew each spring and summer, starting as soft, velvet-covered cartilage and gradual hardening into bone. The growth process is rapid, fueled by the nutrient-rich vegetation of the short Alaskan summer. By the fall, the antlers are fully developed and used for display and combat during the rutting season. But as winter sets in and testosterone levels drop, the antlers detach from the skull and fall off, and the cycle begins again. This biological fact had staggering implications for the investigation. If Oki Koyamada died in 2007, her skull could not have been attached to this specific antler for 9 years. It was biologically impossible. The antler found by Garrick Ryland had grown entirely during the spring and summer of 2016. The timeline was shattered. The realization transformed the investigation. It meant that the skull must have become entangled in the antler recently, within the last 6 to 8 months. This realization posed a central, baffling question. If Oki died in 2007, where was her skull for the intervening 8 years? And how, after all that time, did it end up on a moose antler in 2016? The investigation shifted focus. It meant that Oki's remains had been resting somewhere else, undisturbed for 8 years. Before being disturbed and picked up by the moose in 2016, the location where the moose was found might not be the location where Oki died. The moose could have traveled miles from the site of the entanglement. The investigators analyzed the entanglement itself in light of this new information. The skull was firmly lodged. The biologists suggested that the entanglement might have occurred when the antler was still growing and softer during the velvet stage. Perhaps the skull became embedded in the soft cartilage, and the antler tissue grew around it, hardening into bone and securing the skull in place. This would explain the firmness of the connection. But it also suggested a very specific window of time during the spring or early summer when the entanglement occurred. Theories began to circulate, attempting to explain this bizarre phenomenon. Had Oki's body been preserved in ice or a glacier for years, only recently exposed by thawing? This was a possibility in the Alaskan wilderness, where climate change was rapidly altering the landscape, exposing long frozen remains. If her remains had been washed out of the ice, they could have been deposited in an area accessible to the moose. Another theory was more sinister. Had the scene been staged? Had someone found Oki's remains and deliberately attached them to the moose? This seemed highly unlikely, given the difficulty of approaching a wild bull moose, especially during the antler growth phase, when they are particularly sensitive. Furthermore, the entanglement appeared organic, albeit bizarre, with the bone structure suggesting the antler had grown around the skull. To solve the mystery, investigators needed to determine where the moose had been during the spring and summer of 2016. They needed to backtrack the animal's movements, not just over days or weeks, but over the entire growth cycle of the antler. Traditional search methods were insufficient. Investigation required a breakthrough, a way to read the history recorded in the bone of the antler itself. The wilderness held secrets, and it seemed determined to reveal them in the most bizarre and unsettling ways. The realization that Oki Koyamada, a skull had only recently become attached to the moose antler, presented a unique and daunting investigative challenge. The location where Garrick Ryland found the moose was likely irrelevant to the location of Oki's death, the place where her remains had rested undisturbed for 8 years. To find the rest of Oki's remains, and potentially those of Yumi Hamasaki, investigators needed to determine where the moose had traveled during the specific time frame when the antler was growing and the entanglement occurred. This was a monumental task. Bull moose can roam over vast areas. The Alaskan wilderness offered endless possibilities, a landscape defined by its sheer scale and inaccessibility. Traditional investigative techniques like ground searches and aerial surveillance were too broad, too inefficient for the magnitude of the problem. The investigation needed a way to narrow down the search area, a method to read the history recorded in the evidence itself, a way to turn the antler into a map. The breakthrough came from an unexpected field: geochemistry. Investigators turned to a highly specialized and innovative forensic technique known as strontium isotope analysis. Strontium is a naturally occurring element found in rocks and soil, and it is absorbed by plants and water. The ratio of different strontium isotopes varies geographically, creating a unique chemical signature for specific locations. When animals consume these plants and water, strontium is incorporated into their tissues, particularly bones and teeth. reflecting the geological signature of the area they inhabit. The key to this case was the unique biology of the moose antler. Since the antler had grown entirely during the spring and summer of 2016, it had incorporated the strontium isotopes from the water and plants the moose consumed during that specific time frame. The antler grows from the base outward, laying down new bone tissue rapidly over the course of the summer. By analyzing the strontium isotopes along the length of the antler from the base, in the late spring of 2017, as the snow finally receded from the high country, a specialized team of Alaska State Troopers and forensic experts was deployed to the remote valley identified by the strontium isotope analysis. The deployment was a significant logistical undertaking. The valley was inaccessible by ground vehicles. The team and their equipment had to be transported by helicopter, establishing a base camp in the rugged terrain. The isolation was profound. The silence broken only by the sounds of the wilderness and the occasional radio communication with the outside world. The objective was clear but daunting: to locate the site where the moose had encountered Oki Koyamada's skull and hopefully, to find the rest of her remains and any evidence related to Yumi Hamasaki. The terrain was exactly as described: extremely rugged, characterized by steep slopes, dense forests, and numerous water crossings. The search would be slow and methodical, requiring meticulous grid searches of the valley floor and the surrounding slopes. The initial days of the search were grueling and yielded nothing. The valley was vast, and the exact location of the entanglement remained elusive. The teams found signs of moose activity tracks, droppings, browse signs, but nothing that indicated the specific site. The wilderness remained indifferent to their efforts, the dense vegetation concealing any potential evidence. Recognizing the limitations of ground searches in such challenging terrain, the investigators turned to technology. They utilized aerial surveillance, employing helicopters equipped with high-resolution cameras and, crucially, LiDAR light detection and ranging technology. LiDAR uses pulses of laser light to measure distances to the Earth, creating precise three-dimensional maps of the landscape. Its power lay in its ability to penetrate the dense forest canopy, revealing features on the ground that might be invisible from the air or obscured by vegetation. The LiDAR data was processed and analyzed on site, creating detailed topographical maps of the valley. The investigators scrutinized the data, looking for anomalies, depressions in the ground that might indicate a burial site, disturbed vegetation, or anything that seemed out of place in the natural environment. The process was painstaking, requiring a trained eye to distinguish between natural features and man-made disturbances. It was during this analysis that they identified an anomaly. Hidden under the dense canopy of a stand of old-growth trees, the LiDAR data revealed the unmistakable signature of a man-made structure. It was small, rectangular, and completely invisible from the air due to the overlapping branches. The geometric shape stood out starkly against the organic patterns of the wilderness. The investigators cross-referenced the location with official topographical maps and land ownership records. The structure was not present on any official records. It was an unmapped, unregistered cabin hidden deep within the wilderness. The discovery was electrifying. The presence of a hidden cabin in this remote valley, the very area where the moose had likely encountered Oki's skull, immediately raised suspicions. It suggested a human presence in an area presumed to be uninhabited, a presence that might be connected to the disappearance of the Botanists. The team mobilized to the location of the anomaly. The approach was difficult, requiring a steep hike through dense brush. Tension was palpable. This hidden structure could hold the key to the entire mystery. They approached cautiously, moving silently through the dense vegetation, securing the perimeter before moving in. As they neared the coordinates, they finally saw it. A small, primitive cabin constructed from rough-hewn logs nestled among the trees. It was well concealed, designed to blend into the environment. The cabin appeared unoccupied. There was no smoke from the chimney, no signs of recent activity. The decision was made to enter the cabin. Given the circumstances, the remote location, the unregistered nature of the structure, the proximity to the likely site of the entanglement, the investigators obtained a search warrant authorizing a full forensic examination of the premises. Inside, the cabin appeared to be a standard hunting shelter. It was sparsely furnished, containing a wood stove, a crude bunk, and basic supplies. It showed signs of sporadic used canned goods in the pantry. Firewood stacked by the stove, but nothing that immediately indicated a crime scene. The interior was dusty and smelled of decay and wood smoke. The forensic team began a meticulous search of the interior. They processed the surfaces for fingerprints and DNA, collected samples of dust and debris, and scrutinized every object in the cabin. The search was exhaustive, recognizing that any evidence might be concealed. They examined the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, looking for hidden compartments or disturbed areas. It was during the examination of the cabin floor that they made the breakthrough. The floor was constructed of rough wooden planks. One of the planks seemed loose, slightly offset from the others. They carefully removed the plank, revealing a small concealed compartment dug into the earth beneath the cabin. Inside the compartment, hidden in the darkness, they found a collection of objects that instantly connected the cabin to the missing botanists. There were specialized botanical tools, a soil auger, a plant press, and a GPS unit, all identifiable as the type used by Oki and Yumi. The tools were rusted and deteriorated, but recognizable. But the most chilling discovery was a small, deteriorated piece of fabric. It was light blue with a distinctive pattern. It matched the description of the dress Yumi Hamasaki was known to be wearing when she disappeared, the same dress visible in photographs of her. The evidence transformed the cabin from a simple hunting shelter into a crime scene. The presence of their equipment and the piece of Yumi's clothing suggested captivity or foul play. The disappearance was no longer a tragic accident. It was a kidnapping. The investigation shifted focus immediately and needed to identify the owner of the cabin. The task was challenging, given the unregistered nature of the structure. Investigators began the painstaking process of cross-referencing trapping licenses, bush plane flight manifests, and local knowledge. They searched for anyone known to frequent this remote area. They canvassed the small communities on the edge of the wilderness, interviewing experienced hunters and trappers, asking if anyone knew of the cabin or who used it. The interviews were delicate. The people who frequented the deep backcountry were often solitary and suspicious of authority. The investigation finally identified a person of interest. His name appeared on several old flight manifests, indicating travel to the general vicinity of the valley. Local knowledge confirmed that he was known for his long solo excursions into the deep wilderness, often disappearing for weeks or months at a time. The suspect was Wyatt Bledsoe, a solitary man living in a nearby small town. He was known for his eccentric behavior, his expertise in wilderness survival, and his avoidance of human contact. He was a ghost, a man who moved through the wilderness unseen. The identification of Bledsoe marked a turning point in the investigation. The abstract mystery of the antler had led them to a concrete suspect. The focus shifted from the wilderness to the man who inhabited it. The identification of Wyatt Bledsoe as the likely occupant of the unmapped cabin galvanized the investigation. The evidence found beneath the floorboards provided the probable cause needed for an arrest. The Alaska State Troopers mobilized to locate Bledsoe. He was found in the small town where he maintained a residence, a nondescript house on the outskirts of the community. He was taken into custody without incident, appearing surprised but not panicked by the sudden appearance of law enforcement. He seemed more annoyed by the intrusion into his solitary life than fearful of the consequences. Bledsoe was transported to the nearest interrogation facility in Fairbanks. He was a man in his late 50s, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, with a guarded demeanor and eyes that seemed accustomed to scanning vast distances. The interrogation room was sterile, a stark contrast to the wilderness he inhabited. The investigators were aware that they were dealing with a highly intelligent and elusive individual, a man accustomed to solitude and self-reliance. They knew that extracting a confession would require a methodical psychological approach. The initial phase of the interrogation was focused on establishing a rapport and assessing Bledsoe's reaction to the evidence. He was initially evasive, answering questions with minimal information, neither confirming nor denying anything. He was calm, collected, seemingly unfazed by the sterile environment of the interrogation room. He maintained the demeanor of a man accustomed to silence, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. The investigators presented him with the existence of the cabin. They showed him the photographs of the structure, the LiDAR images that revealed its hidden location. Bledsoe acknowledged knowing the area but claimed the cabin was abandoned, a relic of an old trapping line used sporadically by anyone who happened upon it. He denied ownership or exclusive use of the structure. His demeanor remained impassive, offering plausible deniability for any connection to the cabin. He maintained this facade for hours, displaying the patience and resilience of a man accustomed to solitude and hardship. He deflected the questions, offering plausible explanations for his presence in the area, minimizing his connection to the cabin. He was intelligent, cunning, and deeply familiar with the wilderness. Using his knowledge to create a narrative of coincidence and plausible deniability, the investigators knew they needed to break through his defenses. They decided to confront him with the evidence found beneath the floorboards. The strategy was to overwhelm him with the undeniability of the physical evidence, shattering his carefully constructed narrative. They presented the photographs of the botanical tools, the soil auger, the plant press, the GPS unit. They emphasized the specialized nature of the equipment, its direct link to the missing botanists. Bledsoe remained impassive, suggesting the items could have been left behind by others who used the cabin. Then, they presented the piece of light blue fabric. They placed the photograph of Yumi Hamasaki, smiling brightly in her blue dress, next to the photograph of the deteriorated fabric found in the cabin. The match was undeniable. When confronted with this evidence, Bledsoe's solitary facade began to crack. His demeanor shifted. The calmness was replaced by a subtle agitation, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding the gaze of the investigators. He realized the gravity of the situation. The connection was too direct, too intimate to be explained away by coincidence. The investigators pressed him, highlighting the inconsistencies in his story, the improbability of his explanations. They emphasized the forensic evidence linking him to the cabin and the victims. They spoke about the 9 years of agony the families had endured, the relentless search for answers. And then, after hours of intense interrogation, Wyatt Bledsoe confessed. The confession was chilling, a detailed account of the events of August 2007, delivered in a monotone voice, devoid of emotion, as if recounting a mundane hunting trip. It revealed a story of survival, desperation, and calculated cruelty. Bledsoe recounted that he was at his cabin when the massive storm hit. He was accustomed to the severe weather, prepared and secure in his hidden shelter. On the second day of the storm, August 14, 2007, he was checking his traps near the cabin when he encountered Oki and Yumi. They were lost, disoriented, and showing early signs of hypothermia. They had been caught in the storm, their gear insufficient for the intensity of the weather. They were off route, having deviated from the high-altitude ridge in a desperate attempt to find shelter. They were on the verge of collapse. Bledsoe stated that he offered them assistance, guiding them to his cabin. They were grateful, relieved to be out of the storm, provided them with food and warmth, playing the role of the savior. But Bledsoe admitted that his motivations changed rapidly. He was a solitary man, isolated from society for long periods. The presence of the two women in his cabin triggered a dark impulse. He felt entitled after rescuing them, a sense of ownership over them, decided he wanted Yumi. Later that evening, as the storm raged outside, he made advances toward her. Yumi resisted, rejecting him forcefully. Enraged by her rejection and emboldened by their isolation, Bledsoe assaulted her. Oki intervened, fighting desperately to protect her friend. A violent struggle ensued in the cramped confines of the cabin. During the chaos, Oki managed to break free. She fled the cabin, disappearing into the raging storm, into the darkness and the howling wind. Bledsoe did not pursue her. He made a calculated decision. He was confident that she would not survive. The wilderness and the weather, coupled with her weakened state and lack of gear, would quickly kill her. He assumed her remains would be scattered by the elements, never to be found. He let the wilderness dispose of the witness. With Oki gone, Bledsoe turned his attention back to Yumi. He confessed to holding her captive in the cabin for several weeks. The details of her captivity were horrific. He subjected her to repeated abuse, physical and psychological torture. He broke her spirit, asserting his dominance over her, isolated from the world with no hope of rescue. Yumi's fate was sealed when she attempted to fight back. Several weeks into her captivity, she managed to free herself from her restraints and attacked Bledsoe, desperate to escape. He overpowered her again, and in a fit of rage, he murdered her. He confessed to burying her body near the cabin in a concealed location designed to remain undisturbed, He then meticulously cleaned the cabin, hiding their gear beneath the floorboards, erasing any trace of their presence, and returning to his solitary life as if nothing had happened. The confession provided the answers the investigators had sought for 9 years. It was a horrific account of opportunistic violence, a predator taking advantage of a situation created by the unforgiving environment. However, when pressed about the discovery of Oki's skull on the moose antler, Bledsoe's demeanor changed again. He vehemently denied any involvement in the entanglement. He insisted he never saw Oki again after she fled the cabin. He claimed he had no idea how her skull ended up on the moose antler 9 years later. The investigators were skeptical. They suspected that Bledsoe might be withholding information, perhaps reluctant to admit to a detail so grotesque and bizarre. They theorized that he might have found Oki's remains years later and staged the scene, a sick trophy of his crime. But Bledsoe maintained his denial, his voice firm and unwavering on this specific point. The mechanism of the antler entanglement remained a mystery. It's a final, unresolved detail in a case defined by its bizarre circumstances. The confession, however, was enough. It provided the location of Yumi's remains and the evidence needed to secure a conviction. Following Wyatt Bledsoe's chilling confession, the investigation moved swiftly toward its conclusion. Guided by the details provided by Bledsoe, investigators returned to the remote valley and the unmapped cabin. The focus shifted from investigation to recovery. They focused their search on the area surrounding the structure, looking for the concealed burial site he had described. The terrain was difficult, and the burial site was well hidden, covered by years of accumulated debris and vegetation. But with the precise location identified, the specialized team managed to locate the site. They began the meticulous process of excavation. The atmosphere was somber as they uncovered the remains hidden beneath the soil. The remains were recovered and transported to the medical examiner's office. Forensic analysis confirmed the identity: Yumi Hamasaki. After 9 years of agonizing uncertainty, Etsu Hamasaki finally had confirmation of her daughter's fate. The news was devastating. The details of Yumi's captivity and murder were almost unbearable, but it provided the closure she had desperately sought: the ability to finally mourn her daughter and bring her remains home. The legal process against Wyatt Bledsoe proceeded quickly. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, including his own confession and the discovery of Yumi's remains, Bledsoe chose to plead guilty, avoiding a trial that would have forced the families to relive the horrific details of the crime. In 2018, Wyatt Bledsoe was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Yumi Hamasaki, and charges related to the kidnapping of Oki Koyamada. He received a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. Extensive searches were conducted in the area surrounding the cabin, attempting to locate the rest of Oki Koyamada's remains. The searches failed to find anything further. Authorities concluded that Oki perished in the wilderness shortly after her escape in 2007, succumbing to the storm and the harsh environment. Her remains were likely scattered by scavengers and the elements over the intervening years. The mechanism by which her skull ended up on the moose antler 9 years later remains an enduring mystery. Whether it was a freak natural occurrence, perhaps her remains were unearthed by erosion or a landslide, and the moose, thrashing its newly grown antlers against the ground, became violently entangled, or a gruesome detail that Wyatt Bledsoe to the end refused to admit the truth, remains unknown. The bizarre discovery that broke the case wide open ultimately remained the one detail that defied all explanation. This story is a powerful reminder that while the wilderness can hide secrets for years, the truth has a strange and persistent way of finding its way to the surface, often in the most unexpected and bizarre ways imaginable. The case of Oki Koyamada and Yumi Hamasaki is a harrowing tale, but it's also a testament to the powerful, unyielding nature of a mother's love and the strange ways the universe can reveal the truth. For 9 years, the wilderness held its secrets, guarding them with a silent, indifferent strength. But the one detail that defied all logic, the biologically impossible discovery of a skull on an antler, became the key that unlocked a decade of silence. It was a bizarre twist of fate that brought a murderer to justice and gave a grieving mother the closure she so desperately needed. This is a story that reminds us how the most bizarre details can lead to the truth. We've seen how a mother's relentless love and a hunter's moral choice brought a cold case back to life. What part of this story shocked you the most? Did you ever suspect foul play, or did you believe it was just a tragic accident? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more incredible stories like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video.